I'm going to ask you straight off, right at the beginning of this, um, what what sort of things make you or people in general ashamed, so that we can identify what this experience, what you think this experience is. What are common experiences of shame?
Asking a foolish question.
Yes, asking a foolish question
And being laughed at.
and being laughed at. Yeah, that. Yes, yes.
Although if you do some sin, that is not.
If you do some sin, you might feel shame. Yeah.
Or if somebody close to you does the sin.
Somebody.
I'm thinking of a child whose maybe mother or father did some sin and then the child.
Right. Right. So if a parent commits adultery and everyone knows at the church, the child or the teenager is going to feel very ashamed that their family is marked in that way. Yeah. Any other?
Realistic or unrealistic, unmet expectations. So there's
Okay.
expectations that you do not meet, and they're real or unreal.
Right. So can you give an example of an expectation of? Right. So maybe some misunderstanding at work about the expectations. You don't live up to their expectations. And it does bring distance between you and a sense of shame. I didn't do what I should have done. Yeah? Thank you for asking the question. We will explore that difference. No, that's a good point. What is the difference between shame and guilt? Yeah, we'll come to that. Any other sort of things that pop into your head of experiences of shame? When you disappoint someone. Yeah. Right. And maybe talking about experiences you've had that are shameful may be somewhat shameful. So even talking about this topic actually raises a certain level of shame. But as I think about this, some common examples might be for a young person, they fail their exams, or if you're a student in university, you fail your exams. Of course, we know that in Japan, people commit suicide over failing exams or not getting into college because, as we'll see, it is a very shame-based culture where you have to do what the family wants you to do. There are high expectations. If your marriage breaks down, especially if you're a believer and you're in the church, there's an expectation that it won't break down, so you feel a level of shame. We use the word embarrassment often, that's a more common word, but I think shame, that's what shame is. If you have problems with your children, and one of your kids is not doing well in school or is playing with drugs or, something that people know about, then you will feel shame, maybe that you're not a good parent. You're not a success in the eyes of your family and friends, in your career or in your relationships. And we could go on down the list. The shame that people feel when they lose a job and are unemployed. That's often a very difficult thing for men in our culture. Just being weak. I had one young woman who came to see me at the seminary where I'm working now for counseling. She had grown up with a family where she went through 3 very significant losses, and the most significant was her grandfather dying in a very dramatic way. I think he bled to death or something in a sort of public family gathering. And she, as a 9-year-old, was sort of standing at the back of the room watching all this, and everyone getting hysterical and calling the ambulance, and nobody talked to her. And nobody came to her afterwards and said, that must have been really upsetting for you, and explained what had happened and helped her to process what it was like. And that, in a sense, was symbolic of what happened in the whole of her life. Nobody took her emotions seriously, so to cry for her was weak. And of course, many men feel crying is weak. And so when she came to see me, she was telling me this story about all these things that had happened, and she was smiling all the time. Terrible things that were happening in her family, and I commented, and I said, I commented on the fact that she was smiling, and then of course she started to cry, because really under this smile she was holding back shame at being weak. She wasn't allowed to be weak as a child, and certainly wasn't allowed to be weak in the presence of her father. And I was a sort of father figure at that sort of age difference between her. So for her, just crying in my presence was shameful. It might be being too fat, not being beautiful, not living up to the glossy images on all the magazines that women are supposed to look like, being too skinny, being poor, having an old car. My kids, when they were in their early teens, they went to a private school where there were quite a lot of wealthy parents, and they drove Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs, and we drove an old rusty Honda. And my kids sometimes would say to me, "Dad, don't take me up to school, just drop me at the bottom of the driveway." Later on, they were actually quite proud of this old car. But at first, it was a shameful thing. You know, when you're not wearing the right clothes, or driving the right car, or living in the big enough house, or whatever it is. For me, as I get older, I struggle more with names of people. And I feel I should be able to remember all these names. I meet everyone and I stare down at your stomach trying to see the name. And I feel embarrassed. I feel ashamed that I can't remember it immediately. Some couples who can't have a child, who are infertile, and they go through this monthly cycle of grief, of trying to have a child. And it's a sort of silent, you don't talk about it very much amongst other Christians, and there's a sort of silent shame in this way. It's not a moral issue, it's just, it feels like something's wrong with you, though. Many of the soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with PTSD are too ashamed to go and get help from a psychologist or psychiatrist. Sorry, post-traumatic stress disorder. So they may have experienced terrible things with, being blown up and so on. Young people who have grown up in a home where sex was never talked about and maybe was treated as something that's dirty and bad, they may feel shame when they have sexual desire at puberty, this strange feeling, and I shouldn't be feeling this. This is dirty. This is wrong. Someone who's been sexually abused may feel very ashamed at some of the things that they feel. So you could go on down the list. Someone who is an addict, who is, I put last here, going to seminary. Some students who come to our seminary, theological college in the States, who come from non-Christian families, feel ashamed because their parents think they're a bit weird because they're so religious. And for them to go into the ministry is just the last thing that the parents would want. I have some non-Christian friends in St. Louis, and I know that they think that the seminary is a very fundamentalist, narrow-minded, homophobic place. And so I feel ashamed even to admit that I work there. Maybe ashamed even of being a Christian. I'm sure there are circumstances at which you may have felt that. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of we might say that it is a traumatic in the sense that it brings a lot of anxiety to us, exposure of, might be sin, because I think, and we'll talk about whether you should feel shame when you sinned or should you just feel guilt. We'll get to that. It might be that we are seen naked in a state of undress by someone accidentally, and we immediately feel shame. We might do something foolish that isn't actually sinful. You walk down the street in public place and you trip on a stone and you feel, oh, I'm stupid. That's so foolish to feel that. Weakness, deficiency, inferiority, powerlessness. These are the sort of experiences I've been describing in those examples. We basically feel that we're somehow flawed and unworthy. A man called Taiba says, to suffer shame is to feel that the true self, with all its defects, is exposed, naked, and vulnerable to the damning judgment and criticism of others. So it's when that part of us that we try to hide from other people, most of us live behind a sort of mask, the things we show to other people. I don't, most of the time, admit to people that I have a hard time remembering names because I feel sort of ashamed. But you might discover it one day. But there are other things about my life that I don't, I mean, at this age, I'm less worried, less ashamed of my weaknesses than I was 20 years ago. So I'm more prone to talk about them publicly. And shame is triggered when we anticipate disapproval or rejection by those who matter most to us. So whether it's your family disapproving of you, or your employer, or your husband, or your wife, or your children, or your parents. And that feeling of shame is one where, I mean, what do we do when we're ashamed? We tend to not want to make eye contact, do we? We tend to look down or look away, because seeing someone's eyes, they're looking into your soul, they're seeing, either literally or metaphorically, sort of seeing you with your shame. So we tend to look down or cover our faces. The old German word, shame, I think, comes from an old German word meaning to cover. So you're trying to cover yourself. And shame affects the way we think and feel and act. It's a sort of feeling of anxiety. And when we feel ashamed, sometimes when you're caught in the act of doing something foolish or sinful, it's like you're sort of like a deer in the headlights. You know, you feel somewhat paralyzed. And we have this whole person response. But I think many people are actually don't name the experience as shame. They may think of it as something else, or they know they feel uncomfortable, but they don't know, put a name to it. And Carl Jung called shame the swampland of the soul. You know, a swamp where you may get your feet stuck in it and you may get dragged down into the swamp. It's a sticky place that is hard to define. It's hard to get out of. Others have called it the master emotion, that shame is behind a lot of other emotions. So that when you feel depressed or when you feel angry, it may actually be the deeper emotion, may be actually shame. So we compare ourselves with how we think we ought to be in order to be accepted. So I think I ought to be very articulate and intelligent and theologically minded to impress you, so that you don't go away thinking, that Richard Winter, you know, and then I don't do a good performance and I feel ashamed of myself. If I don't do a good workshop, I haven't done something morally wrong, unless I was just lazy and didn't prepare at all. But it may be something that I feel ashamed about because I value your opinion. If my whole identity is based on being a good presenter, I'm really living for the good opinion of others. So this is where Dan Allender says it's empowering another to determine our desirability and worth. So you empower your parents to determine your desirability and worth in terms of whether you go to college or not. They won't love you and accept you unless you do go to medical school and become a doctor, when really you want to be an artist. And you feel ashamed of your artistic leanings. So in a way, I give the right in this to someone other than God to take away my security, identity, and peace of mind. Now, when you think of what sort of things do you think typically men, think of the differences between men and women, what sort of things do you think typically men get ashamed about as compared to women? What status?
No, failure.
Failure, yeah, failure would be one. Weakness, emotional weakness particularly, yeah. Fear, being afraid, yeah, so they have to be strong, have to be tough, not emotional. Are there any other things? What about women? Not beautiful, exactly, yeah. Rejection, is that, yeah, yeah. Being stupid, sorry. Being not so intelligent, right, right. I mean, being everything, not being everything, not being superwoman. Yeah, yeah. Sorry? Childless, yeah, exactly. So, I think you've said most of these. Weakness, fear, failure, yeah, you went right through them. Being wrong. Men have a hard time being wrong and admitting it. Being criticized. They should be strong, fearless, and powerful. And if they're not, then they feel ashamed. For women, being not beautiful and maybe sexy in our culture, not thin, not successful at work and motherhood, not being superwoman. So these are typical. There's a lot of overlap, of course, but these are typical things. So as we think about, so this is trying to sort of define the experience and the sort of things we feel ashamed about. Let's go back now and think of this within a biblical framework, a biblical worldview, back to the creation and Adam and Eve. Here is a beautiful painting that probably you know. Here are Adam and Eve after the fall. So before the fall, there is no shame. There is no guilt. After the fall, they are expelled from the garden, and it's interesting to see what they are doing, what is represented in this painting. To go a little closer, Adam, of course, he doesn't want to see what he's done. This is horrible what I've done. I realize now how terrible the consequences are. And Eve has this agonized look on her face too, but she is covering her genitals, so she's covering her groin and her breasts. That's not so important for Adam to cover himself for some reason. But the Genesis account talks about them as pre-fall. It explicitly mentions they were naked and they had no shame. So before this, they were naked and they had no shame. After the fall, something happens and their eyes are opened. Their awareness and intimacy feels now like intimidation, like a threat. Both psychological intimacy and physical intimacy, I think, makes them anxious in some way. So there are mixed feelings about it. They're aware of their nakedness. They cover up. God gives them a covering. They hear God coming, and they're afraid, they're ashamed, they're guilty, they're hiding from God. And God says to them, "Where are you?" So this, I think, is the origin of shame. And when we ask, and we are, when you're talking with someone in counseling, sometimes when I see someone who I can see they're sort of just on the edge of tears, or I can see fear in their face or their body or anger, and I might use that expression of, "Where are you? What's going on inside you at this moment?" And usually they're ashamed to tell me. But it's that same question that God is asking. I don't think he's asking physically, "Where are you in the woods hiding from me?" He's asking, "Where are you in your heart before me?" become aware of the shame, the guilt, and what you have done. So as we then move back into thinking about the experience that we have in our families, in our churches, in our cultures, think for a moment about shame-based cultures. Now this is important because there are a lot of nationalities in this room and in this conference. We think of some cultures as being very individualistic, don't we? The USA particularly, a rugged individualism. Australia, the UK, I think most of Western Europe. And then we think of Asian countries as being much more collectivist. Some of you may work in China, Japan, and African countries. In fact, most of the rest of the world, apart from North America and Western Europe, is much more collectivist in its view of life. I think this comes out particularly starkly in the difference between the United States and Japan. I have a student or at least I had a student, she still works for us, who is from Japan, and she's been helping me to understand that in her family she grew up, she was called always by her last name, not her first name, and in school she had a number, not a name. So this is a sort of taking away her individuality. She's part of the system. And you know, in some Japanese companies, they all have to wear the same uniform. And the military in our own country is good at sort of depersonalizing people, cutting your hair off and making you wear uniform. And so you lose something of your individual identity. And you're not supposed to speak up for yourself. You're supposed to follow the orders. You come to care very much about what the family think of you or the company think of you, and the way that they control you is by shame. It's social control. They make you feel bad when you don't live up to the expectations of family or that particular group of the culture. And we in the West are much more want to encourage, and certainly in North America, kids to speak up, to tell us their opinion. To have a voice, to have ideas, and to be separate from their families. And although we like them to do what we want them to do, we also value them separating and developing, becoming independent adults. So where does Eastern Europe fit in this? So post-communism, collectivism, afraid to speak out, afraid presumably of being an individual. But as you move away from that, then as you say, it's sort of both. You're trying to be more individualistic. Were you about to? So a lot more initiative in the younger generation than in your parents' generation. And many people say to me that the men in Eastern Europe tend to be very passive. And maybe the sort of Soviet control was felt more by the men than the women. Yeah. So it is as you're moving away from the collectivist towards the individualist. Now, and obviously from a biblical point of view, there's a sort of, both are good things that we can learn from each other, and both, in a sense, are extremes of taking us away from, I think, what God intended us to be. He wants us to be individuals, but he also wants us to be part of a body, of the church, of a family, of a culture. So you think it's the unity and diversity of the Trinity, three in one. Each individual of the Trinity has individuality, but they are one. Each individual of a family has individuality, but they are a family. And holding those two in tension is difficult, and I think in a fallen world, the cultures have, in a sense, polarized in these ways. So we need to learn from each other in this. So people are afraid to be responsible so that they get blamed when something goes wrong. I mean, that's true of most of us. But yeah, I think that's, and the more individualistic you are, in a sense, the more responsibility you have to take. Yeah. So the tendency you're saying in Bulgaria is to choose a strong leader who will we don't have to take responsibility, we just follow him. Yeah, that is always a danger, I think, in a collectivist culture, that they're vulnerable to that. Yeah. We're going to have to move forward here. So back then to the internal world of the individual, our experience of shame and guilt is sort of like an internal evaluation system. It's a signaling device to produce some sort of reaction. So this is where we get to the distinction between guilt and shame. And that traditionally now I think it's helpful to summarize it down to guilt is in relation to morals, in other words, actions. What I do, you're either guilty or innocent. That's the way the Bible makes that distinction. Shame is in relation to models, and by that I mean what the person you think you ought to be. This is a very intelligent, bright, well-dressed person. That's my model in life, and I should be like them. And if I'm not, I am ashamed. And it means that you feel you are bad as a person, as a whole person. You haven't necessarily... So shame, well, will come... the biblical contrast with shame, the opposite seems to be in Scripture, honor or glory. So you have a glory, you're made in the image of God, and if you don't live up to that image, then you might feel legitimate shame. So we're going to make it more complex, and there are some urgent hands going up here. Sorry, at the very back. No, it's not here. That's an interesting question. The question is about shyness, how this relates to it. I mean, shyness may just be anxiety in social situations, but usually that would be compounded by shame. When you're shy, you feel ashamed that you're not living up to, and especially if you come from an extroverted family or an extroverted culture like the North America culture, whereas if you come from Japan, shyness is not a problem. You're supposed to be shy. Did you want to come in on this?
Shame surely is not what you think you should be, but what others think you should be.
It's what you think others want you to be. Exactly. Yes. Thank you. So I've given you here a couple of examples. You know, the wise inherit honor, but fools he holds up to shame. They exchange their glory for something disgraceful or shameful. And I love this quote. I've used it in another workshop here from Prince Caspian, C.S. Lewis. You come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve. That is both honor enough to lift up the head of the poorest beggar, and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. So there is an honor as we experience being made in the image of God and living out the glory of that image in fulfilling our calling and being what he's made us to be. But there's also at the same time a shame of being a sinner and a broken person and someone who inherits the sin of Adam and Eve. So we have these dual feelings in us of dignity and depravity, of honor and shame. And if you think of Job, in this example of Job, Job says, when Job has suffered so much and he's trying to understand why he's suffering, and his counselors are telling him he must have sinned, and he says, if I sinned, you would be watching me and would not he's talking to God here, and you would not let my offense go unpunished. If I'm guilty, woe to me. So he knows if he's done something wrong, if he's sinned, he needs to be punished, or he needs to confess and be forgiven. But he says, even if I'm innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my affliction. So he's saying, even if I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not guilty, but now I am covered in there's awful sores all over my body. I am a poor man, which usually signifies in that culture that I must have done something wrong. So he's feeling ashamed amongst the people that he is with. So this detection system of guilt and shame is very complicated, and this is where it gets more complicated because it's badly damaged in many people. It's like your smoke detector goes off at the wrong time when there isn't a fire and doesn't go off when there is a fire. That's what it's like for some people who've had their systems damaged by a lot of dysfunction in their families, or really bad experiences in childhood, or ignoring their conscience. I'll come back to that in a moment. So now we have to talk about true and false guilt and true and false shame. When you do something wrong, I think it is right that you should feel, it is right obviously that you should feel guilt. And I think there is a right sense that we feel shame, that we have dishonored the image of God in us. And there is a different remedy, as we will see, for guilt and shame. But the problem is true shame and guilt should be a signal that should lead us to sorrow and repentance over our sin. So that the smoke detector goes off, says there's a fire, you've committed a sin, you should go to God in repentance and ask His forgiveness. If you think of, well, I'll come back to Peter a little later on, I think. So, and true and false shame and guilt, very often we don't like the feeling of shame and guilt. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and our instinct is to go away from discomfort, isn't it? And to go away from internal pain. So we often hide from it, or we bury it. We don't want to feel it. So we don't deal with it in the right way, and then it gets even more complicated as you push it down inside you. Now, another complexity in all this is that there are actually distortions of shame. This is where the smoke detector is completely out. You might be ashamed of doing well in school. Why would you be ashamed of doing? Because all your peers mock you for working so hard. Your parents want you to work hard. They want you to go to college, but the other kids in school are, maybe they're envious, and they pull you down to their level. You might be ashamed of not being brave enough. If you grow up in a New York gang or in the mafia, you might be ashamed of not being brave enough to lie or steal or cheat or take drugs or have sex, promiscuous sex, or to kill someone. You might be ashamed of knowing Christ in a family where there are no other believers. And the Bible speaks to that shame of knowing Christ. So this is where your conscience has been completely tipped upside down, both in relation to guilt and shame. So you might not feel guilt or shame at killing someone if you're a member of the mafia. So when we look at the roots of false shame, we can think of examples like growing up in a family where you have a very critical or abusive or distant parent. So your parent, who is very perfectionist, very critical, whenever you don't get an A in school, and you may have 6 A's and 1 B, and what do they notice? They notice the B. And they don't give you any, they ask, why did you get a B? And they don't give you any credit for getting the A's. Or if you're mowing the lawn, the grass for them, and they notice the place that you didn't get. They notice all the imperfections. So a perfectionist environment is a great breeder of shame. You may not have done anything morally wrong, but you haven't lived up to their standards. And abuse, of course, will produce that even more. And we could go into that later if you want to. I mentioned bad teaching about sex before, earlier on, in one of the examples. that may make a child or an adolescent feel ashamed about their sexual desires and feelings and their body. Sexual abuse, when children are sexually abused, sadly, when a young person has a bad relationship with their parents in the home and they're not getting much affection or touch and they're looking for affection, and they may get involved in a relationship with an older person who takes advantage of them and does arouse them sexually. And quite often in that context, the child may actually enjoy the touch and the sexual arousal, as well as deep down feeling guilty. So there's this awful ambivalence in their hearts of shame and guilt. And shame, as they get older, they may feel ashamed that their body allowed them to enjoy that experience. So there's a lot of very confused and twisted emotions involved as a result of sexual abuse. And I think many churches, especially churches that are very legalistic, they make you feel ashamed if you don't come wearing a suit and a tie or the right dress. For them, that what you wear or whether you come to all the meetings that the church organizes is more important than the state of your heart before God. So their value system may be not very biblical. You may be ashamed that you don't hold the same view on baptism as the majority of the church. And the church might add to that shame. So it's performance and appearance based. In our culture, the models that are held up for young people are often the film stars, the rock stars, the music stars, the fashion models. Those are the people that you should be like. Is that a good basis for your standards of who you want to be? But you often feel ashamed when you don't live up to that. And then our own sin and foolishness. Now, as I said, I guess that's a bit confusing to put that in there, because it should be just our foolishness, because there is a right sense of shame over our sin. But sometimes we do things that are not necessarily wrong, they're just foolish, unwise, and we do feel shame about that. So a shame-prone sense of self, if you grow up in a home that is very shaming, or a culture like Japan, you tend to believe there's something wrong with me. I'm bad, defective, unlovable, inferior. Well, now, it's true that because we have fallen from God's glory and the image of God, there is a sense in which something is wrong with us. But this is going beyond even that. Okay? It's saying that you at your core are a really bad, defective person. I'm stupid, I'm untalented, I'm a failure, I shouldn't show my weaker emotions. This is the sort of, and so in any relationship, this is the core feeling that comes out if you've grown up in the shame-prone culture. So shame, I think, comes out in two directions. It either is internalized with what I call shame anxiety, and you may become very perfectionist, reacting to it. I should be flawless and constantly productive because you've been shamed. This is your attempt to get over that shame. It might lead to an eating disorder. I should be in control of everything in my life. At least I can control my body weight and my size. If I can't control anything else, I should look perfect. And that will allow me to be accepted by other people. Or we might use addictions to alcohol, drugs, sex, work, to dull the pain of shame. And then, of course, you feel a double shame because you're an addict. And you feel, although it helps some of the pain, then it adds more to your shame. We may withdraw so that we're not around people who make us ashamed. So you don't go to parties anymore, or you don't, in your work, you keep to yourself. You don't get involved in conversations in case if you open your mouth, you feel embarrassed about what you've said. And that may lead deeper into depression. So that's one way, the internal way. The other is the outgoing shame, anger. So you may treat people with arrogance or contempt. You feel smaller than them. So what's the way to make yourself feel bigger? You put them down. You get angry with them. You treat them with contempt. You intimidate them. You control them. You induce shame in others. And I think you quite often see this in pastors, in leaders of churches who've come from very broken homes. Their way of dealing with shame is not to acknowledge their weakness. They want to be seen as powerful, as in control. They just take it out on others by trying to control everyone else, becoming very judgmental and critical, and then perhaps at the same time self-critical and withdrawn. I think this word contempt is a very powerful word. It has in the way you say it, contempt. You know, it sort of gives that feeling, doesn't it, of real hatred of someone. And Dan Allender puts it this way: the shamed person can turn his eyes away from the penetrating gaze and focus on the element in his own being that is the cause of the shame. Or he can attack his enemy's eyes directly with the poison of his hatred, blinding those eyes so their power is nullified. So what he talks about is self-contempt or other-centered contempt. You have contempt for yourself or arrogant contempt for other people. And that's an attempt to save face, to deal with this feeling of shame. Now, so of course, shame, in a sense, exposes the idols of your heart, doesn't it? It exposes your value system. Why do I feel ashamed about giving a poor workshop? Because for me, an idol of my heart might be having the good opinion of other people. Whether it's appearance, the idol of my heart might be that I should look perfect all the time. I should look like the Hollywood models. And that may be so important that I build my whole life around it, and I feel ashamed when I don't live up to that. I spend a lot of time and money on my hair and makeup and my clothes and so on. It might be on your performance, that you have to work incredibly hard to get everything right, spend hours at your work, because it matters so much to you what other people think of you, or being very productive. And in the American culture, the gods of the culture are beauty, brawn, by that I mean body muscle for the men, brains, and bucks, money. Those are the sort of contemporary idols that many people try to live by. So where does this take us in terms of, as we think about where do we go with shame? What do we do with it? And I think our shame, our legitimate, true shame and guilt should lead us to sorrow and repentance before God. So when I do something wrong and I'm aware of sort of losing something of the glory, it should drive me to, as Adam and Eve, Adam says, John Milton in Paradise Lost has Adam saying, "O miserable of happy, is this the end of this new glorious world, and me so late the glory of that glory?" He's guilty, he's ashamed. So it should lead us then to a sorrow over our own sin, but then when we feel ashamed for things that are not our fault, when people have sinned against us and damaged us with sexual abuse or cruelty in childhood, we also can come to God with the sorrow of having been sinned against. And in a sense weep before him and grieve at the loss of the glory that he gave us because of other people's sin. So we grieve, we are sorrowful because of the way we're sinned against and because of the way we are sinners. So here we come to the distinction between what is the remedy. Guilt is dealt with by punishment or confession, repentance, and forgiveness. I've done something wrong. I come to him and I confess. And as Isaiah 53 says, he was wounded for our transgressions. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So Christ's sacrifice deals with our guilt, and we are forgiven and given a right relationship with God. Blessed is he whose transgressions are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Your guilt is taken away, your sin is covered. Now, some people who feel a lot of guilt and don't go to confession and sorrow and confession will often go to penance rather than repentance. And penance is just working hard to absolve your guilt or your shame, isn't it? I've got to keep doing good things. I've got to keep being kind to other people. I've got to work harder for the Lord to try and it's a sense of I've got to do it. I've got to get rid of this guilt and shame by my own effort. So it can lead to perfectionism. It can lead to extreme would be obsessive compulsive disorder or even paranoia. Now, shame and redemption. Shame is the remedy for shame is being accepted with all your deficiencies and faults and folly and finiteness and weakness. It's about an experience of grace, isn't it? Of God accepts you with all your imperfections, your sinfulness, your brokenness, your woundedness. In our Western culture, we tend to focus, in the individualistic cultures, we tend to focus more on guilt and the work of Christ for our forgiveness and dealing with our guilt and our sin, don't we? That's where we talk about and we preach the gospel. We don't speak so much about shame. But if you go to Japan and you focus on sin and guilt, I think you will actually miss quite a lot of people. And I think there's another aspect that we also need to bring in, is that the cross of Christ also deals with our shame, because in the death of Christ on the cross for us, he is also saying, I accept you. I give you a free gift of forgiveness and grace. And that is different, I think, a different part of our salvation, as it were. You can think of the way in the story of Hosea and Gomer, and I'll leave you, we haven't got time to go into that now, but perhaps with Peter, you remember Peter, after he has denied Christ 3 times, when Christ is being tried, and after the resurrection, Peter must have felt incredibly ashamed, mustn't he? And incredibly guilty for what he did. And he's obviously, in his relationship with the Lord, he has confessed, he's been forgiven. But Jesus takes him for a walk on the beach and reassures him 3 times and recommissions him, showing him, I accept you still, Peter. I'm not rejecting you. And I think he's dealing with both guilt and shame. The acceptance of shame takes much longer. It's not a transaction, it's an ongoing relationship. So you may have, say, committed adultery, and you come back and you are deeply repentant, and your wife or your husband forgives you, so you are forgiven. They see your repentance, but still you may feel very ashamed of what you did. And you keep coming back and saying, I'm really sorry, I'm so sorry for what I did. But what you're really feeling, I think, is a lot of shame, and it's only through that your spouse accepting you again and again that the shame begins to fade away. You can think of the prodigal son, and he comes back to his father, and I think he is repenting of his sin, and he's also saying to his father, I did something sinful and foolish, and I don't deserve to be your son anymore. And the father, in a sense, is showing by his actions that he forgives him, but he's also accepting him and doing more than just accepting. He says, you're not going to be a servant, because the son says, I'm only good to be your servant now. I'm not really a son. He says, you are my son. Let's get out the best robe. Let's have a party. Let's put on the grand ring and have a feast to celebrate that my son has come back home. So he's dealing, I think, with both guilt and shame. Dealing with the guilt and shame of Adam and Eve. So I love this passage from Zephaniah, well-known passage, about God's grace and delight. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. I will gather those who mourn for the festival, so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with all your oppressors, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. This is a statement of acceptance. Not just forgiveness, but far more than that, acceptance, delight, changing the shame back into honor and renown in all the earth. So it's acceptance with all our deficiencies, faults, folly, grace in relationships. We've talked about Peter and the prodigal son. And the ultimate shame of the non-believer, of course, will come when Christ returns and they face the judgment of God. But for believers, they will not be put to shame. And I think that the final thought on this is that the big picture enables us to endure and despise some shame that other people may make us feel for being Christians. So in Hebrews we read, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. The world scorned people who hung on a cross. But sometimes we are called to do things in this world where we will be scorned. We will be made to feel ashamed. When you stand up and acknowledge you're a Christian amongst your non-Christian friends. So Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace or the shame that he bore. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. So ultimately, the wise and the so-called strong will experience the shame of realizing that their strength is an illusion. So until that day when he returns again, we know that we are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory. We've been given glory and honor in being made as in the image of God, but he goes on increasing that glory the more we become like him. And there will be ultimately no more shame that we will experience when he returns again. Now, I know that I've probably made this topic, there are all sorts of complex bits of it, and I hope I haven't confused you too much. I honestly find it hard to get my mind around a lot of the areas of shame. I've tried to sort of distill down to the essentials that I've come to in thinking about this. Yeah. What I said was that guilt is the experience of we should experience guilt when we sin, when we have done something wrong. Now, and shame, so you say to yourself, I have done something wrong. With shame, you say, I am a bad person. It's a much more whole feeling of not just I've done something wrong, but I feel I've... So that would be the sort of main difference, I think, between guilt and shame. So the question here is about inherited guilt and in terms of what we have inherited from Adam. That is our fallen nature. And we are, in a sense, we are all sinners, right? But we are responsible for what we have done. We are not responsible for what Adam and Eve did or what our parents did. But we do carry some of the shame and the guilt with us, it's true, of that sinful nature. So it's a subtle distinction here. And there is true and false guilt, I think, and true and false shame. I'm not sure whether I'm really answering your comment, your question here. Are there other things people want to explore in this? Yeah. So the question is about this concept of when we've done something wrong, we have come to God and confessed, but people talk about the need to forgive yourself. And I was saying yesterday, sometime, that I think quite often when you've been forgiven by God, in a sense your guilt is dealt with. What remains is much more a feeling of shame that I haven't lived up to God's standards or my own standards. And it's more a matter of learning that God accepts me and I need to accept myself, even though I have done something wrong and foolish. So I'm saying, as I said yesterday, I think it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one, because I think, in a sense, you can accept yourself. I'm not sure that you can. We talk about, have we actually offended ourselves and done? You could talk about the fact we've wronged ourselves. And when you say you've got to forgive yourself, right? We've lost honor of God's image. That's right, and lost the glory. And that is shame, isn't it? And I think that's primarily what you're dealing with in that situation. Once you've been forgiven by God, you're dealing with that sense of, it feels like guilt, but I wonder if it's not more accurate to describe it as shame. Yeah, wounded glory. That's a good way of expressing it. Yeah. That's a very interesting concept. So you're saying the Bible was written in a shame culture, and we are moving away from often any sense of wrongdoing. We're losing a moral sense, any sense of guilt. And once you get rid of guilt, the only thing and absolutes in right and wrong. You can be guilty, people would say, in relation to the law of the land. That's our moral standard, isn't it? It's not against a God, because you don't believe in God anymore. And then so that's a means of social control, is the law of the land. And then the expectations of others and society and your group become the other thing that is a means of social control. And in a totalitarian state, that becomes a much more powerful thing. But I think it's true that in some ways, some of the stories that Jesus tells are more understandable in a shame-based culture. In India, in Africa, sometimes they grasp this a lot more easily than we do. So you're saying when we as Christians do something wrong, we feel guilt.
But we're very less likely to feel
We're less likely to feel shame. Yeah, because the culture accepts it. So for one example that comes immediately to my mind is the whole issue of pornography. It's accepted in our culture. As a Christian, you might feel guilty that you're indulging, but everyone else is, so you don't feel shame at all, except I think you should feel shame in relation to God. But he's more distant and you can't see him and he's not around every day with his eyes looking at you. It's true, that's a very good... I think that's what the passage in Scripture that talks about they glory in their shame. They're actually turning the value system upside down. So in things they should feel shamed about, they actually glory in them, which would be pornography, sexual promiscuity, and so on. Someone else did they have a hand? Yeah. So in relation to depression, which one, guilt or shame, is more leading to depression? I think it's both. I mean, I think you can feel guilty. You can get depressed because you have done something wrong. There is a quicker solution in the sense of forgiveness. There's also a lot of shame behind a lot of depression. I think there's a lot of shame behind a lot of anger, behind a lot of anxiety. So this is where I see it as almost a master emotion, the one that's behind a lot of things. Now the tricky thing too is that you may get depressed because of shame and guilt, but when you are depressed, seriously depressed, you also feel a lot of shame and guilt. You might feel false guilt. You might feel you've done things wrong which you never really did do wrong, a delusional guilt. But you also feel a lot of shame because you're depressed. So it's teasing out which is cause and which is effect. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. But that's why it's sort of often a tangle in our heart. I often think of our emotions. We often feel a sort of, I feel really bad. I'm not quite sure what's going on in my heart. And as counselors, often I think we are sort of helping people to name their emotions. It's like a sort of knot of string, and you're teasing out the different strings, and you're saying, could this be anxiety? Could this be guilt? Could this be shame? And what do you do about each of those? And once you've named them, you can do something about them. But when they're there, all tangled up together, it's just ugh, and it affects you, comes out in all sorts of bad ways. And people who have grown up in homes where they've experienced a lot of dysfunction and emotional turbulence and maybe alcoholic parent often have a really hard time naming their emotions. And shame is a pretty sophisticated one too, to name. And I think part of our task as parents with young children is to help them to name their feelings. And to when they are angry, when they are sad, when they are unhappy, to begin to put names to shame and guilt and sadness and anger and frustration and disappointment. And that gives them more control, and they're less ruled then by their emotions in unhelpful ways. Yeah. Elderly people. Good question. What kind of shame do elderly people have? Think together about this. What do you think? Some of you are, oh no, you're not elderly. Shame for being alone. Do people feel shame because they're alone? Yeah. They're not exactly elderly. But you're right. I mean, that is an area of shame. This is what you're saying too. Women who are single in their 30s, 40s, and later in life, that may be true too. Perhaps hopefully they've come to accept it more by then, but maybe not. Yeah? What other things do elderly people feel? Sorry? So the shame over illnesses and dependency. My father became deaf in his old age, and he would never tell anyone. I said, Dad, why don't you just tell people? There's nothing to be ashamed of. But no, he was ashamed of being deaf. I feel ashamed of, memory failures, and that probably will get worse. Oh, I did? Thank you. A public shaming. So we try not to shame disabled people by Paralympic Games and providing resources, ramps and everything for wheelchairs, and they're part of the normal society. But for the elderly, yes. So you can't come to the end, near the end of your life, looking back and feeling I didn't really listen to God, do what I should have done, or I wasn't a good parent to my child. I didn't pursue that career that I wanted to. Yeah, that's right. So at every age, you have to think about what typically do people feel shame about. Yeah, I mean, part of dealing with shame is being able to admit and be accepted with your feeling of shame and also with whatever disability you're dealing with. It's encouraging people, I mean, making space where people feel safe enough with you, cultivating a relationship where you obviously accept them and then maybe can help them to talk about their struggles and maybe even just asking them, what's it like for you getting, when you became 70, what were the things that you had to struggle with in your life, or 80, or when you got sick? What was that like for you? Help me to understand. And in that way, being curious, being interested in them, recognizing by your question that it might have been difficult. You're trying to reduce the level of shame and saying, I accept you, with whatever it is. I don't know, other people have ideas about that or experiences of that? Do you know, I have a heart. There are a number of secular books on shame, and I haven't found there are different places where there are small. I think the work of Dan Allender, he does very well with shame, especially in The Wounded Heart, where he's talking about sexual abuse primarily, but there's a lot about shame in there, which is very helpful. The Wounded Heart, Dan Allender, Allender. In my book on depression, this one, there is a chapter on shame. I don't go into it in nearly so much detail as I did here, but some of the broad principles are there. So usually I find it in chapters, or do you know any, Evan, of good books on shame? And that reminded me of Dick Keyes, Keyes, has a book called Beyond Identity. And he talks about shame in that. He talked about the broader ideas of identity from a biblical perspective. He really got me going on thinking about shame many years ago, and I realized, just the more I got into it, the more complex it got. That's a really good question, how we help children not to develop this false shame. And I think there are some families, as I talked about, that are shame-based families. The way they control their children is through shaming them. And so here it would be if a child knocks over a glass of milk at the breakfast table, and you say, "You stupid idiot, you are such a clumsy person. You always do that." That would be shaming, wouldn't it? Whereas a more grace-based parenting, rather than shame-based parenting, would be a recognition that children cannot be expected to always, they do fidget, they do jump around, and you ask them to help you to clean it up, but you don't make them feel as if you're a really bad person because you spilled that milk. When they do something that's really wrong, then you have clear consequences, and a clear punishment maybe sometimes, or very clear consequence as a result of what they've done wrong, but you don't keep driving into them and telling them you are such a wicked person because you did this. It's a sort of character assassination rather than you did something wrong, there is a consequence, and you will need to do this, and you can be forgiven. But even sometimes when we forgive, they still have to deal with the consequence, the practical consequence. So I think, does that give some clues to the difference? So your question is more about children who are made to feel ashamed by their peers at school for working too hard or not lying, and how can you? And so that's more a sort of support of parents. And will your children talk to you about that sort of shame? They might not. They might be too ashamed to admit it. So it depends on keeping a relationship with your children, being able to talk about what's going on in school and how they feel about it, and the things that make them happy, the things that make them sad, so that you can help them to express what they're feeling, and then to talk about their values and, you know, it's not wrong to work hard in school. You don't need to feel ashamed for getting good grades. And I'm proud of you, and God is proud of you for what you do. So it's helping them to deal with the competing value systems. And that you don't need to feel ashamed as a teenager if you're not having sex. That's a powerful one too in this day and age. Or you're not looking at pornography, or you are a Christian. So I think it's the relationship that is the most important thing, to be able to talk to your children about it. Our time is just about gone. Maybe we should finish here. So thank you for your attention and good questions.